Good day, class. You are welcome to session 4 of nursing research. In this session, we'll be talking about the background and problem statement, which means we are building on what we did in the earlier sessions. So we will try to explain the difference between the background and problem statement. And so I'm expecting that by the end of this session, each of you will be able to describe a researchable problem statement, explain the criteria, format, and characteristics of the background and problem statement, and then the differences between the two. And so we will be talking about the overview, or we'll look at the overview of the background and problem statement. We will try to explain the problem statement criteria and then the purpose statement. For this session, you can read from the two books, Foundation of Nursing Research, chapter 5, and then chapter 5 of Criswell, which is research design, qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method research. So let's start with the overview of the background and then the problem statement, and then we will see how we can differentiate between the two. So you are doing a research, and then your supervisor or lecturer requires you to have an introduction or to have a background. Why must you write a background for research? Now, the background is a very important component of the research report. The background provides a full description of the problem you have identified. The background gives you an explanation or a description of the variables that you want to study. And so the background has several functions or several important areas, because if the background is not well written, people reading your research will not know what you have researched. They will not be able to identify the variables that you have identified, and they can't even differentiate that between the background and then the problem statement. So it's important that we talk about these areas. Criteria. Now let's look at criteria for writing the background. I mentioned earlier that the background is where you describe the problem you want to study. So you start with the research problem. You have to discuss, in trying to describe this research problem, you have to discuss the studies that have addressed the problem previously. And this is where you are able to come up with the deficiencies or the shortcomings of previous studies that have studied the same area. And so you describe the importance of those studies that you have reviewed, and then importance of your research, and then finally you will conclude nicely with the purpose. In this conclusion, you are also coming up with some gaps that you have identified in the literature that you wish to cover in your research. So that is the background. Now let's see the problem statement. What is the problem statement? You have written the background. The next thing for you to write is the problem statement. The problem statement is an explanation of the problem that you want to study. The background, you are describing the problem. Problem statement, you are explaining significant reasons why it is important for you to do this research. You have several reasons why it is important for you to do this research. How you explain this problem gives you the problem statement. And of course, you need some literature to back the problem statement. So let's look at the difference between the two. The problem statement gives you the why of the research. Why are you doing this research? So justify why you are doing the research. Provide the basis for generating, the purpose of the research. That's what the problem statement does. So basically, those questions or those answers that you give to the why, that explanation is what gives you the problem statement. The what of the research is what gives you the background. What are you studying? What does it involve? When you describe that, that becomes your background. So that's the difference between the two, the why and the what. So now let's look at the problem statement criteria. How do we write the problem statement? so that if I'm reading, I know that this is different from the background. The problem statement should be written in what we call interrogative sentences. Interrogative in the sense that you are curious about something, and so that curiosity has to be seen in the way you write the problem statement. It is written to include the population and then the variables that you want to study, which means explaining all of these things. And for it to be empirically testable, it means that you are writing in an interrogative language or interrogative sentences. In the subsequent slides, we will look at other ways of writing which may not work well for problem statement. And one of those ways is the declarative way of writing the problem statement. So if you declare that a problem exists, it's as if you already have the answers to the problem. So there's no need for research. And that is why you cannot write the problem statement in a declarative sentence or in declarative sentences. So now let's differentiate between the two, being interrogative and then being declarative. So these are just some few examples. For instance, being interrogative means you could have any of those. Is there any relationship between the reading habits of nurses and knowledge development in nursing? That is being interrogative. You don't have an answer and you want answers to this. Being declarative means you write it in the following way. This study determines the relationship between the reading habits of nurses and knowledge development in nursing, which means that you are already saying that there's a relationship between the two. So we mentioned at the beginning that you need to include, this explanation needs to include the variables. So the variables involved here are the reading habits of nurses and knowledge development. Now, explaining the answers to the question is the problem statement. Explaining the answers to the questions you have in the interrogative sentences is what gives you the problem statement. Now, if you write it in the declarative way, the curiosity to search for answers is lost because you have somehow confirmed that there are answers. So there's no need to do research. So problem statements are written in interrogative sentences, not in declarative sentences. Now, you need to also include the population in your problem statement. The population is the group of people that you want to study. The previous examples that I gave didn't include the target population. So let's look at this example. So the population should be narrowed down to the main group of interest, that is the target population. So for instance, instead of reading habits of nurses, it should be reading habits of clinical nurses or reading habits of academic nurses. So you have narrowed down the population. In the previous example, we said reading habits of nurses. We didn't differentiate between the categories of nurses. Here we have been able to do that. It must also include the variables to be studied. The problem statement must also include the variables to be studied. And there may be one, two, or many variables involved. So a problem that involves only one variable is called a univariate study. And that which involves two variables is bivariate. That which involves more than two is multivariate. So let's look at some examples of each of them. One variable study is usually exploratory in nature. And an example is reading habits of clinical nurses. Reading habits of clinical nurses. So the only variable here is reading habits. And clinical nurses is the population. Now, on the other hand, bivariate studies. Please look at this example. Nursing research often involves two or more variables. Most of the researches that are done by nurses involve two or more variables. So here an example is reading habits and knowledge development. So if you design a problem to include the two, it means you are doing a bivariate study, or you have two variables in the study. Now, there may also be research problems that involve more than two variables, and as I said, those are called the multivariate studies. And this one, usually the researcher is interested in the interaction between the variables. We also said that one of the criterion is that the problem statement must be empirically testable. What does it mean to be empirically testable? A testable problem statement contains variables that can be measured. Variables that can be measured. So in the previous example that we gave, if you say the reading habit is a variable, it means that you should have a questionnaire on reading habits, or you have some questions on reading habits, so that you can measure the reading habits of nurses. So for a problem statement to be empirically testable, you have to avoid using certain words, such as cause and effect. So for example, instead of effects of reading habits of clinical nurses on knowledge development, it should be the relationship between reading habits of clinical nurses and knowledge development in nursing. This way, you have been able to avoid using the words cause or effect. Now let's look at the purpose statement. We have talked about background, we have talked about problem statement. Now let's look at the purpose statement. What is this purpose statement? If you look at this picture, there's somebody running on some lines that have 3 arrows at the end. So if you are doing a research without a purpose statement, what that means is that you are running without a purpose. You get to a point and you don't know where to go. So without the purpose statement, the researcher may not be able to even start the research. Sometimes you may be able to start, but you cannot end it because you don't have a purpose. So that tells you how important it is to have a purpose statement in your research. So a purpose statement is a single statement that identifies why the problem is being studied. Now let me compare that again to the problem statement. Problem statement is a combination of significant reasons why you must do the research. Purpose statement is a single statement, that explains why the research is important. So the purpose statement specifies the overall goal or the intent of the research. It is stated objectively and indicates the type of the research that you want to conduct. So as I said earlier on, from what I have said so far, it means that if you don't have a purpose statement, you cannot end the research. So let's look at the criteria for writing the purpose statement. Here, this single statement that we are talking about has to be written in a declarative form. You can also write it in a question form, and then you can also write it in hypothesis form. We will look at each of these. How you choose whether to write it in declarative or question form depends on the researcher's knowledge of previous research, and then the type of research approach that you want to use. So a good purpose statement should contain information about what to study, the setting, which is the area where you want to do the study, and then the people who are participating in the research. So now let's look at some examples of purpose statements. The one you have right now is written in a declarative form. We will look at the various formats. So the purpose of this study, and let me emphasize that the purpose statement must always started with the way this example has started. You must say that the purpose of this study is to do something. So here in this example, we are saying that the purpose of this study is to examine the relationship between the reading habits of clinical nurses and knowledge development in nursing. One single statement, and it has said it all. So again, in differentiating between the purpose statement and problem statement, we said that problem statement is written in declarative sentences. The problem statement is written in interrogative sentences. The purpose statement is declarative. because you know what you are doing. An example of a problem, a purpose statement that is written hypothetically. The purpose of this study is to examine the relationship between the reading habits of clinical nurses and knowledge development. And then let's look at a problem statement that is stated, a purpose statement, that is stated in a question format. Is there a relationship between the reading habits of clinical nurses and knowledge development in nursing? So these are the different ways that you can state your purpose statement. So now let's try to see if we can come up with a few differences between the problem statement and purpose statement. So we are saying that the problem statement describes and explains various reasons why the study is important. The problem statement also indicates the content that you want to study. The purpose statement states categorically the main or the primary reason why the study must be conducted, and then it explains the relevance of the study. That is the difference between the two. So in summary, today we have talked about the background, we have talked about the problem statement, we have also discussed the purpose statement, and I have given you the different ways that you can write the purpose statement. So in our next session, we will talk about the objectives and then research questions. Again, your reading list is available on Sakai. So thank you, and I will see you in the next session.